A wise man once said, "Oh, Fate, you mean that weird franchise where they made King Arthur a girl or something?" And that man's name was Albert Einstein. Well, nowadays we have lots of things as anime girls. We have game consoles, we have horses, we have guns. But Fate really was one of the pioneers in the what if X was an anime girl genre. Why did Fate decide to turn so many historical figures, including men, honestly it might be mostly men, into anime girls? Well, I think we need to recognize that for the longest time men were the focus of history, and a lot of historical figures were men. So in order to kind of balance the scales and make a more dynamic franchise, Fate decided to take some of the men and reimagine them as women. Also because anime girls are cute. But this video isn't supposed to be on why they made them into anime girls, but how they made them into anime girls. Because really, there's a lot of interesting ways. There's a lot more variety in that gender swapping mechanism than you would think at first. So what I did is I took all of the gender-bent characters from Fate and put them into groups based off of how were they gender-bent. And because I think it'll be more interesting, we'll start at the most numerous and then work our way down to the least. Before we get into it, a couple quick caveats. One, I'm not going to include any genderless servants unless I think that I have something interesting to say about them, so there won't be any Enkidu on the list. Two, the focus is going to be on characters whose gender swap is like pretty permanent, so I am not going to look at things like the Prisma Ilia installs because those are just temporary. Three, I'm already going to be talking about a lot of servants. There's over 60 that I'm planning on discussing, so I'm not going to go over a lot of the alts of servants unless it's interesting. So whenever I talk about like Artoria, for example, also just know that I mean Artoria Lily and Artoria Lion Gang. Just put them together. Also, just so you know, there aren't going to be any female to male swaps because I couldn't find any. Every swap is going to be male to female, so if I'm talking about it in general, that's why. There is one person that might count as a female to male, but I put them in the special exceptions at the end of the video, so you're gonna have to get there if you want to know who might be in that category. Okay, with all of that established, let's get into our first category, our biggest category, our oldest category, the category that started it all. History remembers them incorrectly. This category is for servants that were always female. They just either disguised themselves as male, or over time, the fact that they were female got distorted and forgotten. There are 20 servants in this category alone, so please excuse me, I'm going to read directly from my list. Of course, we have to put her first, the one that started it all, Artoria, aka King Arthur, the King of England in Arthurian legends. Nero Claudius, the Roman Emperor. Okita Soji, a member of the Shinsengumi. Mordred, King Arthur's traitorous son. Nagao Kagatora, a Japanese daimyo. Gareth, a member of the Knights of the Round Table. Attila the Hun, in Fate she's known as Altera. She has a very interesting story all to her own, but that's not really relevant here, so I'll have to talk about it in a different video. Shuin, an Ibaraki doji, to Oni in Japanese mythology. Ushiwakamaru, a Japanese military leader. Francis Drake, an English sailor, explorer, and privateer. Zhuanzong Sanzong, a Buddhist monk in Journey to the West. Also, I'll apologize right now for all of my pronunciations throughout the entirety of this video. Jing Kei, an attempted assassin of a Chinese emperor. Kato Danzo, a ninja, who in Fate is also a robot. Yui Shosetsu, a Japanese military figure. Minamoto no Raiko, another Japanese military figure. And Zhu Fu, a Chinese mystic. Now there are 3 more in the History Remembered It Wrong category. I just separated them out because I have a little bit more that I want to say about each of them. First, we have the Dioscuri, aka Gemini, aka Castor and Pollux, who are Greek gods from Greek mythology. Well, one of them's a god, the other one's human. I separated them out because first off, they are one servant made of 2 entities. That's not super uncommon in Fate. There are a couple other ones that fit into that category. And the other interesting thing is of the 2 of them, they actually only made Pollux female. They left Castor as male. The next special case that I want to talk about is Oda Nobunaga, a Japanese warlord who is actually a pretty major character in Fates. Also, for some reason, Fate isn't the only one that wants to turn him into a girl. I don't know what's about this guy that everybody wants to see him in a dress, but you know, you do you. So the interesting thing about Nobu is they're only mostly gender bent. If we look at Fate Grand Order, for example, there are actually 3 different versions of Nobunaga in the game. Of those 3, 2 of them are entirely female. They're only female. However, one, Demon King Nobu, who represents Nobu through different periods of her life, actually has a form where she's male. So Nobunaga is, I don't know, only like 90% gender bent, but then again, they're a gag character, so we shouldn't really take them too seriously. And then the last special member of the category is Frankenstein. Also, yes, the servant is actually Frankenstein's monster. It is not Dr. Frankenstein. I'm just going by the name of the servant. Don't be pedantic. What's interesting about Fran is, first off, in the world of Fate, Frankenstein is just real. Like, Charles Babbage is friends with Dr. Frankenstein. He talks about them hanging out. And in this case, I think it's less history remembering the story of Frankenstein wrong. I think it's just an entirely different story. In the Fate version of Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein's goal is to recreate Adam and Eve. So his idea is to create Frankenstein, who in this case is representing Eve, and then later she's going to give birth to Adam. So he wants her to give birth to her own husband. That is an interesting man. It's also pretty clear that the Fate version of Frankenstein is really just the bride of Frankenstein. That's why she's in a wedding dress. Okay, that was a lot. That on its own was a third of the servants that I'm going to talk about on this list. But then again, that is the oldest method of gender bend that's in Fate, so it kind of makes sense that it would be the most populated. Our next method, which is a lot less populated at just 7 members, is they are borrowing someone else's name. Fate is like a lot of fantasy properties where someone's name holds a lot of power, so just giving yourself the name of a different character can often give you similar authority. So these are all female servants going by the name of a male from history. First in this section we have Saika Magoichi, who is another Japanese military figure, yay! Now, historically, and also in Fate, this name doesn't actually belong to only one person in particular. Instead, it's a title passed down amongst the leaders of the group known as the Saika. Historically, every leader of this group was male, so Fate is kind of imagining an alternate history where this character, whose name is Hotaru, ended up being in charge. We have Daikokuten, a Japanese god of fortune. Daikokuten isn't actually summoned in the game, instead we summon these mice that just work for him and are borrowing his title. Then we have Hephaestion, a Greek follower of Alexander the Great. For this character, names go a level deeper because this is not actually Hephaestion, this is Hephaestion's sister, who was never given a name. She was never given a name intentionally because she's supposed to serve as a magical bodyguard for Alexander the Great. Like I said, in the world of Fate, names are very important and hold a lot of power, so her role was to serve as a kind of name body double for Alexander the Great. If someone was trying to curse his name, they'd end up cursing her instead. That's why she does not actually have a name and was summoned with the name of her brother instead. Then we have Tenochtitlan, who is special to me because she was the subject of my very first short on this channel. Tenochtitlan is an Aztec city located in the place of modern Mexico City. The servant that we summon is kind of like an elemental born from the city who came to embody it. Now, on its own, a city isn't actually gendered unless you're going with like the boat rule and we just call them all she. But why I still include Tenochtitlan on this list regardless is because that's not the only name that she ends up using. Tenochtitlan borrows the name of and also shows the abilities of 2 Aztec gods, the rain god Tlaloc and the war god... I give up on that name. The last 3 in this category I'll talk about all together because they all are part of the same group. Of course, in a series where one of the main characters is King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table are very important. So many of the Knights of the Round Table appear as servants, including Gawain, Tristan, and Lancelot. However, in part of Fate Grand Order, we travel to an alternate piece of history known as a Lost Belt. In particular, this Lost Belt is located over the island of Britain and replaces all of the normal human inhabitants with fairy inhabitants. And in this Lost Belt, the Knights of the Round Table have their names borrowed by a group of fairies known as the Tamlin. Members of this group include Fairy Gawain, aka Bargus, a black dog fairy that signals death. Fairy Tristan, whose real name is Balbon Sith. You can basically think of him as a fairy who's like a shape-shifting vampire. And then the most interesting one is Fairy Lancelot, whose true name is Melusine, or at least the name that she's given is Melusine. A Melusine is kind of like a draconic fairy, but Melusine says that even though that's a name that she values, it's not her true name. This is because we find out that Melusine is really just a portion of the body of Albion, the last dragon that lived in Britain. Really, the whole story of Melusine and Albion is really cool. Eventually, I'll make a video on just them specifically, because honestly, it's very interesting. Okay, there's all of our servants that are just borrowing someone else's name. Now let's talk about servants that are borrowing someone else's body. A pseudo-servant is a servant that is made of 2 parts, a human host, and also some sort of heroic spirit, phantom spirit, divine spirit, that for whatever reason can't manifest as a servant on their own, so by combining with a human, they're able to become a full servant. And I have 5 examples of instances where by forming a pseudo-servant, a spirit has their gender bent. Also, you'll see that all the human hosts are just other Fate characters. We have Sima Yi, a Chinese strategist that is summoned in the body of Rains, El Malloy. We have the Indian god Ganesha, who is summoned in the body of Janako from Fate Extra. We have the Greek god of love Eros, and also the Roman god of love Amor, both of which are summoned in the body of Karen Hortensia from Fate Hollow Atraxia. We have the Celtic sea god Manon Matveer, who is summoned in the body of Bazette from the same series. And then we have the Indian god of love Kama, who is summoned in the body of Sakura from Fate's Stay Night. Speaking of summoning servants in kind of unorthodox ways, our next category is servants with a combined spirit origin. One of the neat things about Fate is you're not always summoning an exact copy of a historical figure. If a mage is talented enough, they can make edits to the spirit origin of a servant. You can kind of just think of it as the servant's like spiritual blueprints. The most common example of this is a lot of berserker servants are given something called a madness enhancement, where they trade some of their sanity for physical ability. You can also meld several servants together by combining their spirit origins. And I have 4 examples of servants where that resulted in a gender bend. So one of the first times that we learn about these combined spirit origins is in Shinjuku, which is a chapter in Fate Grand Order. To make useful peons for himself, the villain of that chapter, Professor Moriarty, the villain from Sherlock Holmes, has been combining different heroic spirits together. One of those servants that he makes but never actually shows up in the chapter is Huyanzhou, who is a Chinese general. Moriarty combines him with an Empusa, who is a Greek kind of like half-horse vampire that has the ability to transform into a beautiful woman in order to seduce people. And that results in the Huyan servant that we do end up summoning. Vincent van Gogh, you know, the painter, has a very interesting story for why they're summoned the way that they are. I made a whole short on it. I would go there for like the whole story. But to summarize it, the outer gods, you know, like Cthulhu, put his memories into the body of Clytie, who is a nymph from Greek mythology. They do this to try and get him to follow their instructions. This results in the Vincent van Gogh that is summoned, basically Clytie, but with the memories and identity of Vincent van Gogh. Then we have Sancho, the squire of Don Quixote, the knight from the novel of the same name. In Fate Grand Order, the servant that we summon is actually Don Quixote. Sancho just kind of comes along as a bonus. And while this character has the name and mostly the memories of Sancho, they're actually a combination of a number of different side characters from Don Quixote, including Don Quixote's horse, Rocinante, which is why they're a horse girl, and also Dulcinea, who is the princess that Don Quixote is trying to win the affection of. Lastly, in the combined spirit origin category is actually Okita Soji's sword. Actually, we're talking about Okita Soji Alter, who is very similar to Okita Soji, but she's fighting on behalf of the Earth, and that kind of changes up her personality a bit. And she has a living sword called Rengoku. We see that Rengoku has its own personality, and in fact, it's taken over Okita's body before in order to interact with people. Now, a sword doesn't exactly have a gender, but whenever we hear Rengoku talk on its own, it sounds very male. However, in the summer version of Okita Alter, she actually does something special. She separates part of her own spirit origin, gives it to Rengoku to make him a human body. And it just so happens that this body looks like a tiny version of her. I honestly don't know if most people would count this as a gender bend, but they go from sounding like this to sounding like this. So I personally think, why not put them on the list? So our next category is servants that have had their bodies altered in some way by an outside force. So something came along and transformed them into a woman. There are 3 members of this category, although 2 of them I'm kind of guessing. And funny enough, the 2 that I'm guessing on have a lot in common. Those are Euclid, who is a mathematician in real life and is found in Fate Requiem. Also Jacques de Molay, a French knight who is found in Fate Grand Order and also Fate Grand Order Arcade. But there's something weird. So they first showed up in Fate Grand Order Arcade, and here they're a dude. But then when they showed up later in normal Fate Grand Order, they were a girl. And while we're never told exactly why this happened, it probably has to do with the fact that they are a foreigner class servant with ties to the outer gods. And since their skills have things to do with like seduction, I'm assuming that the outer gods are the ones responsible for transforming their body. Euclid also appears to have some sort of link to the outer gods, so that could be why they're a woman. It could also be just another example of history remembered them incorrectly, but I think that this is more fun, so I'm going to put them here. Because they only show up for like a page. They are not very heavily featured in the story anyway. Now, our one servant that definitely belongs in this category is Sugatani Zenjubo, who is a Japanese sharpshooter. And it's funny because you look at them and you just assume, oh, it's another history labeled them wrong. They really were a woman this whole time, but they just disguised that fact because of prejudices or whatever. But no, they specifically say, hey, I was a dude, but I got in trouble because, you know, I shot people. So I was on the run, and I ran into this cool guy named Kashin Koji. Remember that name, it's gonna come up later. When they asked Kashin Koji for a disguise, they disguised them by turning Zenjubo into a woman. So they definitely had their body altered by an outside force. Speaking of Kashin Koji, why don't we talk about their category? They belong in the category of has had multiple genders over time. So these are characters where in normal history we would think of them as men, and in fact in the story they have been men in the past. It's just that they have the ability to, through different mechanisms, change their gender. There are 3 members of this category as well, and why don't we start with Kashin Koji since I already talked about them. So Kashin Koji is a Japanese engineer and necromancer who is actually responsible for a couple of the different members of this list, including Kato Danzo up at the top and Sugatani, who we just talked about. But besides working on other people, Koji has also done some work on themselves. When we meet them, they're this kind of like spider humanoid, but they talk about how over time they've kind of just tinkered with their body until it results in what we see nowadays. But there's been times in the past where they have had a more masculine body. But it's just because of them being an engineer and switching their pieces out over time. Someone who's done something similar but a bit less mechanical is Francesca Prelati, one of our only non-servant members of this list. Also by far the most attractive. I'm so glad that we're gonna have the full Strange Fate anime in 2078. Francesca is kind of an odd entity in Fate. She is actually a living human, kind of. So her true identity is Francois Prelati, who, if you are a Fate fan, you might know from being friends with Gilderay back in Fate Zero. In their time being alive since being in medieval France, they've actually figured out a way to make themselves quasi-immortal. We don't really get a lot of details, but it appears that when they die, they can kind of reincarnate in a different body. And these bodies have been male in the past, but now she just so happens to be in a female body, which is why she is Francesca. I've also always wondered, I don't know if these are bodies that she like makes or if they're bodies that she like steals. I guess we'll find out. Maybe, hopefully. Please, more Strange Fate content. That's all I want in life. Lastly, in the has had multiple genders category, we have Quetzalcoatl, who is a South American god. So Fate really likes to take divinities and put little twists on them to make them different from what they are like in the real world. So the South American gods in Fate, instead of being like a divine being, they're actually a type of like fungus. And the fungus is able to interface with different human beings in order to operate as a god on Earth. So the Quetzalcoatl that shows up in Fate Grand Order just happens to be an instance where that fungus interfaced with a female host rather than with a male host. Now, I will say that they do give us some different explanations for why Quetzalcoatl looks like this. It could be because of her link to Venus, and of course Venus is associated with femininity, but I think this is cooler, so I'm gonna go with this one. Okay, now we're getting to the much smaller categories. This one only has 2 members, and this one is very unique. In this instance, the servant is genderbent because instead of being themselves, they're turned into a mascot character. The first example of this is for Orion, the hunter from Greek mythology. In Fate Grand Order, when we attempt to summon Orion, instead we end up with this woman, who it turns out is the Greek god of the moon, Artemis. We learned that Artemis cares very deeply for Orion and doesn't want him to get hurt, so she kind of slips into his summoning and takes his place. And as for Orion himself, he's reduced to this tiny little bear mascot. But don't worry, he does get summoned later in his own body, and goddamn, that is a lot of guy. Our other reduced to a mascot member is the servant Katsushika Hokusai, who is a Japanese painter. He's the one that drew like the big wave. You've probably seen it before. When we think that we've summoned Hokusai, we've actually summoned his daughter, who is also a painter in her own right. The reason that Hokusai was turned into a mascot, though, is like way different than what happened to Orion. Instead, this is again the work of the Outer Gods. Cthulhu really likes force-femming people. That's new lore for me. Did you know that? I'm learning that now for the very first time. So much like Van Gogh, the Outer Gods are trying to worm their way into Hokusai's mind, except they were a lot more successful with him. So when Hokusai did manage to kind of break out of it, his body was reduced to this tiny little octopus mascot. And that's why when he's summoned, he comes along with his daughter, because his daughter is kind of standing in for him. Again, she's borrowing his name for the purposes of being summoned. Although uniquely, there's also instances where they can actually combine into one person. Hokusai takes over his daughter's body, which I guess makes that actually fit pretty well into another one of our categories, which we'll talk about now. And that category is they're borrowing someone else's body. So similar to our mascot category, something weird happened to them, so someone else is getting summoned in their place, except in this instance, they're kind of borrowing the body instead of just being a little mascot that comes along with the body. Our first member in the borrowed body category is Sen no Rikyo, who is kind of like a Japanese merchant. His summoning was largely to get revenge on people that wronged him in his life, and he was summoned in the body of a woman named Komehime, who also has problems with the same people, so they kind of teamed up in order to defeat the people that wronged them. Sounds like they should be an Avenger, but they're a Berserker. I don't know. Classes are meaningless. Who cares? The other member in our borrowed body category is Kyokutai Bacon. I have no clue. They are a Japanese author who went blind later in life and relied on their daughter-in-law to do a lot of their writing for them. So when they were summoned in their daughter-in-law's body. Which again, that must really suck for that guy's son. That is an unfortunate circumstance. However, I also think that they were summoned as female, possibly because of an influence of one of their ascensions, which is something that they turn into once they gain enough experience. In particular, the one that we're looking at is a goddess that is featured in one of their stories. So I think that being summoned in a female body is also just to facilitate them kind of embodying this character from their story. Our next category, which also has two members, are servants that come from an alternate universe. So the reason why they're female is because they're from a universe where that person was just always female. The first member of this category is Merlin, the wizard from Arthurian legend. There is a normal male Merlin in Fate. However, in one of the spin-offs called Fate Prototype, instead Merlin is a woman. And remember Fate Prototype, because that's going to be relevant for that one special exception that's going to come up at the end of the video, so keep that one in mind. Our next alternate universe servant is Miyamoto Musashi, who is a Japanese swordsman. The Miyamoto Musashi that shows up in Fate is honestly one of the strangest characters, because they are a dimension hopper just on their own. No influence from any of the protagonists' organizations or anything like that. They just can slip through different dimensions. And in fact, when we run into them the first time, we're running into a still living human being. They are not even a servant yet. They are just alive and can travel between different dimensions. Okay, we're almost done. Every category from here on out only has a single member, so we're getting down to the really unique ways that servants have been gender bent in Fate. First off, they just modified their own body. They just were like, hey, I want to be a chick, sure. And then they were. This is different from our other category because instead of having someone else modify their body, they modified their own body. And the only member of this group is, of course, Leonardo da Vinci. If you've never seen the Fate version of Leonardo da Vinci, she looks like this. Yes, she just turned herself into the Mona Lisa. She's like, hey, I did a great job with that painting. What if I just was that? And honestly, more power to her. We stand a queen. And if you want actual mechanics for it, it's probably just that Da Vinci is very smart. They probably altered their own summoning, gave themselves the golden rule skill that gave them a perfect, in their eyes, body. Our next category is a very strange one. It is servants that were reincarnated while they were still alive into the opposite gender. The only member of this group is Neza, a character from Journey to the West. In the story, they died, but their mentor managed to reincarnate their body, changing them from presumably a male to a female. We never get any confirmation, but they say that they're very uncomfortable about gender, which kind of implies that something happened there. So I'm kind of just, again, working with the information that we have. Next up, we have servants that just are a shapeshifter. They can choose what their body looks like, and they just so happen to make their body look like a woman. The only member of this category is Kichi Hogan, who is a mentor of Ushiwakamaru, both in Fate and also in real life. However, the Fate version is a Tengu, a type of Japanese demon with shapeshifting abilities. This is why they specified that her body is female right now, or at least it appears to be female. Okay, we're almost done. Our penultimate category, one of my favorite ones, honestly, is the servant just has an unconfirmed gender, and because of that, they can manifest as male or female. Well, historically, we usually think of Jack the Ripper as being male because a lot of the suspects were male. Also, just look at the name. Who Jack the Ripper is was never confirmed. And Fate really likes to play with this idea. I made a whole short talking about how they have different interpretations of Jack the Ripper in the series. And in particular, the Jack the Ripper I'm referring to here is the little girl version from Fate Apocrypha. The reason why Jack looks like this is instead of being human, she's kind of like a wraith formed from the spirits of the babies of prostitutes in Victorian London. I don't know a brand safe way to say it, but when I'm talking about babies, I mean things that were almost babies, but stopped for a reason that a prostitute might do. I'll let you logic that one out. That'll be your homework, is figuring that out. Wow, that's dark. No, you don't have to do that. Okay, here we are. We're at our last normal category before we get into like the special exceptions. I will also let you know, this is probably the most controversial category. I think that this is probably the one that the most amount of people are going to disagree with me on. That's because the last category is they are a character whose body is based on a character of the opposite gender. So essentially, I mean that it's a female character, but they are based on the qualities of a male character. And the one member of this category is Chloe Einsburn from Prisma Ilia. The main character in Prisma Ilia is Ilias Vale, who is one of the characters from Fate's Stay Night. And through events, it turns out that Ilia gains an alternate personality in her brain. Ilia is also a magical girl who is able to transform into versions of different servants by combining with what are called class cards that represent the different servants. She can combine with the Saber class card to look like Artoria, she can combine with the Assassin class card to look like one of the Hassans, and if she combines with the Archer class card, she gets the powers of Emiya, who is also her alternate reality brother, but don't worry about that. Through shenanigans, the alternate personality inside of Ilia manages to kind of escape by combining with the Archer class card and builds herself her own body. Body is based off of Emiya. It looks very similar in appearance, it wears similar clothes, and it has similar abilities. This alternate personality becomes its own person called Chloe Einsburn. So the reason why I include her in this list is because her body is essentially the Archer class card. If the card is removed from her body, then she die. And because the particular spirit of that class card is male, I think she can kind of be considered a gender bend. And with that, we are at the end of the list of the normal categories. Now, there's a little bit more for us to talk about. Because first off, I want to talk about servants that are definitely gender bent, but we don't know how. There are 3 members in this not specified category. The first one that I want to talk about is Paul Bunyan. So the real world Paul Bunyan, they're not actually from the real world, is a folktale of a lumberjack that was responsible for developing a lot of the American West. Instead, the Paul Bunyan in Fate is a little girl who can transform into a giant version of herself. We never get an exact reason why Paul Bunyan got gender bent, but they're also a character from a gag manga, so I think that they're probably not worth talking about. Oh, actually, I'm realizing this just now in recording. I forgot to include another servant. I'll talk about them right now with Paul Bunyan because they're actually from the same gag manga. We also have this servant. You know who that is? That is FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Wow. They really just exist for comedy. They're not really given any specific details, but they're really funny and I want to put them on the list, so I'm gonna. Next on the list is Vrita, a dragon from Indian mythology, who is known to be a foe of Indra, who is a different Indian god. She's another servant where it specifically says we don't know why she's summoned as a female, but a lot of the theories have to do with it's probably something to do with the time that Indra tried to trick her by sending a beautiful woman, so she's kind of turning into a woman to just be like, hey, screw you. Last in our not specified category is Dobrynya Nikitich. Oh, I can add Russian to the list of names that I've massacred. Their claim to fame is as a dragon slayer. Again, normally they are seen as a male, however in Fate Grand Order they are summoned as a female. And again, we are specifically told we don't know why they were summoned as a woman, but they give us some options. The first option is of course the old classic, they always were a woman, history just remembered them incorrectly. That's a cop-out. We're not putting that on the list, screw that. A little bit more interesting is the idea that their spirit origin might have been altered by a curse from one of the dragons that they killed. So that could be another reason. They also say that instead of summoning the actual Dobrynya, they might have summoned his wife, who is just pretending to be him. Funny enough, no matter which one of those we pick, he still goes in one of the lists that we talked about earlier. I have my own idea though. I think they literally summoned him as a woman just to make a joke about the fact that his name has nya in it, and they summoned him as a cat girl. But hey, who knows? Lastly, let's talk about some servants that might fit on the list, but I wasn't really sure if they count or not. First, we have Jaguar Man, a pseudo-servant occupying the body of Taiga Fujimura, who is another character from Fate's Stay Night. They all have to show up. The spirit inside of Taiga's body is kind of just a generic Jaguar spirit. They don't have a name, they don't have a assigned gender, so I don't really know if they fit in the list. The only reason why they're here is because the name literally just says man in it. Am I supposed to take that literally? However, I think that it might just be them doing like a Superman, Batman superhero thing, so I don't think that she actually belongs on the list. Next on the I don't know if they count list are actually 2 alternate versions of Artoria. We have Mysterious Heroine X, who is from an alternate universe called the Servantverse, where people have been transformed mainly into servants, and they do adventures in space. It's very goofy, it's very comedic. And Mysterious Heroine X is just their version of Artoria. We have the Castor version of Artoria, also known as Castoria, who's from the alternate universe I mentioned before, where fairies take over Britain. The reason why I don't know if these 2 in particular count is because, while they are Artoria, and therefore they should still be King Arthur, they kind of have their own stories. They're not really ever talked about things like Excalibur in the normal sense. So I don't know if we can really fairly call them a gender bend. They're kind of just their own thing. Similarly, we have Leonardo da Vinci Ryder, who is a smaller version of Leonardo da Vinci that she makes herself. She basically clones herself for story reasons. I don't know if they count because, similarly, they're their own person. I don't know if we can extend the gender bend label to them because for them, they've just always been female. Also on the I don't know if they count list are the demi-servants. Demi-servants are similar to pseudo-servants, except instead of them combining with the heroic spirit, the people are just kind of using their abilities. Examples would be like Koharu from Fate Requiem or Mash from Fate Grand Order. Funny enough, they are both combined with the same guy. That guy, again, another interesting gentleman. Again, I don't know if they count because they're still themselves, they're just borrowing the power of a male heroic spirit. Similarly, we have, and this is a crazy name, just stick with me on it, 9-Tattoo Dragon Eliza. This is a version of Elizabeth Bathory, who is a servant that shows up in a lot of different forms in Fate Grand Order. In this particular instance, she is kind of combined and is representing the servant Shi Jin, which is a character from a Chinese novel. Similar to the demi-servant, she has the power and authority of a male character, but she's still herself. So I don't know if this counts as a gender bend or not. And now, here, at the very end, here is the one servant that might be a female to male gender swap. And you gotta stay with me on this. This is gonna sound crazy. That character is King Arthur, not Artoria, the male version, King Arthur, aka Arthur Pendragon. Crucially, we only get the female version Artoria. The male version does show up in Fate Prototype, that same series where the female Merlin came from. So stick with me on this. By this point, in Fate, we expect King Arthur to be female. But in this series, we have a King Arthur that's male, and that's very novel to see this character as a guy. So I need to ask you, have we come full circle? Is the original character the gender bend now? Because we expect a female character, and we get a male character. Have we... Is the world gone crazy? The original character is the gender bend now? I honestly don't know. I want to hear your opinion, because I don't know if that counts or not. It's kind of crazy, right? And hey, that's the end of the video. We talked about 60 different servants, actually over 60 different servants, arranged into 16 different categories. That was a lot. I actually looked at every single servant to think about, do they fit, do they not fit? So if you'd like to hear more of my inane ramblings, then subscribe, and I will tell you more things about Fate that may or may not be correct, but don't worry, because there's always people to tell me when I'm wrong. But I love that. It's cool. But yeah, thank you for watching. I'll see you in however long it takes me to recover from making this. Have a good one. Bye-bye.